Hello, everybody. Welcome to Aging Strong, Tufts Medical Center's injury prevention and outreach program that's dedicated to sharing information and resources that empowers older adults. This program is sponsored by the City of Quincy's Health Department. I'm going to talk about this interesting stat that I read from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. So today's topic and presenter is from Walk Boston. She'll be talking about walkability and pedestrian safety and the science behind why the road system needs to change in order for safety to occur for pedestrians. So this interesting statistics from 2019 from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration says 6,205 pedestrians were killed in traffic crashes in the United States. That is in 2019. That's basically, according to them, that's 17 pedestrian a day or 119 pedestrian a week killed, or an average of one pedestrian killed every 85 minutes. That's pretty startling and it's very scary. And that's why I am so excited to share with you Aisha Mehrotra, who is going to be talking about walkability, explaining to us what Walk Boston is and how, in particular, older adults who are out there walking and want to be active and healthy, and how they can really be on the lookout for ways to keep themselves healthy and those they love. Aisha, welcome.
Thanks so much, Debbie. I'm really excited to be here, and hopefully, sharing this information today will help people get more involved in the pedestrian advocacy movement. And I think this is such an important issue, especially for older people, as you're saying. So having more people paying attention to this and advocating alongside us will really help our movement too.
Yeah, great. I've never heard of Walk Boston until maybe, was it last year? When Walk Boston approached Boston area injury prevention professionals like myself to learn about what they offer and what they do, and how injury prevention professionals can really play like an ally to help get the word out, right, in the community.
Exactly. We need people from every background involved in this. Injury prevention coordinators are working really directly on this issue. And, from the statistics that you shared as well, this is something that is a really important injury prevention issue. These are all avoidable deaths. And so having everybody involved in their own capacity, whether that's as public health officials, whether that's as social workers or just concerned citizens, we really do need people to be paying attention and advocating to make the changes that we really desperately need.
Definitely. A few months ago, myself and other injury prevention professionals did a walkthrough in, was it the Brigham?
It was Longwood Medical, yeah.
And Walk Boston explained to us the areas that are dangerous, and what possible solutions can benefit the pedestrians. And it was really an eye-opening experience to be able to see how basic structural changes can enhance pedestrian safety.
Yeah, exactly. And, I think all of us, when we are walking in our neighborhoods or in somewhere new, we feel, I feel really great walking here. This is a lovely walk. Or I hate this. I feel like I'm walking along the side of a highway. And you have that sense of safety, of comfortability, but you don't necessarily know what it is about that space that is making you feel comfortable and safe or not. And so a lot of what we do is just point out what those pieces of infrastructure are, the policies are that can help us get to those really lovely, comfortable, inviting places to walk. And often those are things that are not just elements that will improve safety, but also make a neighborhood feel like a community, right? And it's not just about minimizing harm, but also about creating joy and having places that people want to be navigating and walking around and spending time in.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. I believe you have a presentation to share with us.
Do yes.
So I'm just so excited to learn more about walkability and just the science behind it and how people can really, like you said, have joy and as they're walking around.
Exactly. Yeah, and so I hope that the presentation will touch on some of those points today. Please stop me at any time to ask me to go into more detail or to give more examples. I love talking about this stuff, and so if anything, you'll have a problem stopping me. But yeah, so let's get started. As I said, I'm really excited to be here on behalf of Walk Boston to share about this issue that I think is so important to everyone, but especially for all of us as we age. And it's so important to us at Walk Boston to have more people engaged in this movement. Before I get started with the presentation itself, I do want to introduce Walk Boston. Our name implies that we work only in the city of Boston, but that is far from the truth. We've worked in over 130 communities across the state to help them create safe, vibrant, and inviting streets where people of all ages, abilities, and other identities feel welcome. And whether or not your city is highlighted on this map, I really encourage you to reach out to us if you feel like there's a pedestrian issue that needs support in your community. Or even if you have a story of a cool pedestrian or age-friendly project that you think we should know about. So if anything over the course of this presentation or the discussion sparks an idea, please reach out to info@walkboston.org and we'll discuss the number of ways that you can get involved in our work and start an initiative to make improvements in your own community. So let's start by talking about why walkability is important. By now, it's well proven that walking is good for our physical health as well as our cognitive and mental health. And I think, Debbie, you actually did an episode of this show on physical activity and brain health. So health is one really important reason why we want to support walkability. But some of the other benefits of walking are also to our environment. Walking is a zero carbon way of getting around, and improving walkability in communities makes it easier for people to access mass transit as well, and to not have to rely exclusively on cars. So that has benefits not only in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but also to the pollution in a community. And in the US, cars are a symbol of freedom, but the average American outlives their ability to drive by 7 to 10 years. Then that's not to mention the number of people who have disabilities or don't have access to cars for whatever reason who are unable to drive. And so designing communities where walking is safe, accessible, and comfortable as an option is really important for helping people age in community. Otherwise, once you can't drive, you're largely trapped at home or isolated from your community. And one of the other reasons why walkability is important is because a strong sense of community is another benefit of walking. People living in walkable neighborhoods trust their neighbors more, they participate more in community projects and volunteer more compared to non-walkable areas. And importantly, the social connections formed by walkable neighborhoods and the strong social infrastructure that they have builds crisis resilience. So neighbors who know each other are more likely to check in on each other during a time of crisis and provide mutual aid. So for climate disasters and other times of crisis like the pandemic, being in places where you get to know your neighbors, where you know what people need and how you can support each other is so important. And then last, there are economic benefits of walkability, right? So transportation is the second highest household expenditure in the US, and walking is a much cheaper way to get around than driving and all of the additional costs of car ownership. So making neighborhoods more walkable also strengthens people's individual financial situation, but also strengthens local economies by increasing retail and support for local businesses. Now, we do also know that these benefits and access to safe walking and walkable communities is not evenly distributed. This chart shows just one example of how Black, Indigenous, and other people of color are at particular risk for traffic violence. In Massachusetts, Black and Latinx pedestrians have roughly double and triple the rate of pedestrian injury compared to white pedestrians in the state. So these communities need to really be prioritized as we advocate for walkability measures so that we make sure that the solutions we're proposing don't further harm people and communities that have already been at the front lines of many other forms of systematic oppression as well. And again, this is one example. This chart is one example of the way that disparity manifests, but it's not just in injuries, it's also in fatalities. And age is another important factor, and older people are a demographic category at acute risk. So around the country, pedestrian fatalities are up, and older people are disproportionately killed. Last year in Massachusetts, despite us kind of bucking the trend nationally of traffic violence increasing, last year in Massachusetts, a third of pedestrians killed were over the age of 65. And I'm happy to discuss these national and state level trends later in more detail because there's a lot to say about them. And then for some local context, this is a snapshot of some of the pedestrian injuries in yellow and fatalities in red in Quincy from the start of 2019 to yesterday when I pulled this data from the MassDOT crash data. And in that period of time, there have been 245 reported crashes where pedestrians were struck. That doesn't mean that someone was injured enough to have to be taken to the hospital, but it was just all of the reported collisions. And there were 11 cases where people were killed, where pedestrians were killed. One of those fatalities was earlier this year, 2 were last year, but in 2020, Quincy had a really high number, so 7 people were killed while walking in Quincy in 2020.
Aisha, before you go on to the next slide, why do you think there was a higher number of fatalities in 2020 during the pandemic when we were supposed to be at home?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. And I think a lot of people have been talking about that and speculating about it because I think that there was sort of an expectation actually that traffic violence would go down in 2020 because fewer people needed to commute to work and people were largely kind of staying at home. But the flip side of that is that because there was less activity on the streets and because, or on the roads, I should say, that people who were driving felt like, oh my gosh, there are fewer other vehicles that I need to be looking out for. And so people were speeding more, were paying less attention than they otherwise would. Part of the issue, I think, is that when you're driving a car, you're really paying attention to other people driving because they're the ones who are also in, a dangerous, heavy vehicle. You're not paying as much attention to pedestrians and to bicyclists as you are to other threats to you. So when there were fewer cars on the road, it kind of gave this liberty to drivers to speed more and to not pay as much attention as they otherwise would. It could also be related to the additional stress and anxiety that people were feeling, and so they weren't as focused on the road. And at the same time, you had more people who were going for, socially distanced walks and trying to get out of the house by going for walks. So there were more pedestrians out as well, potentially.
And do you think pedestrian crashes are underreported?
That's a good question. I do think that that's very possible, especially if there isn't an injury that warrants taking someone to a hospital. When you get into a car collision, you are more likely to report it if you have to for insurance reasons. I did also, so the MassDOT crash data includes information on hit and runs, and I was looking at that information for Quincy when I was looking at this yesterday. And while I couldn't see in the last 3 years any hit and runs that resulted in a fatality, there were a lot of reported cases of a pedestrian being struck, but it was a hit and run where the driver did not stop to make sure that the pedestrian was okay. So yeah, it's very possible that pedestrian collisions are underreported, and also that drivers are paying less attention to that as a scenario than they are when they're colliding with other cars.
Right. Thank you.
And so, looking at this information, walkability is important for many reasons, both nationally and locally. And there is a profound crisis that we need to be working on addressing. And I hope that this session will give folks ideas on how they can be part of this movement to prevent pedestrian injury and death and create communities where we can all feel safe and thrive. So moving beyond why walkability is important, I think right now is a good opportunity to pause. I've been saying walkability a lot, but I'd like to explain what exactly it is that I mean when I use that term, because the language around walkability and pedestrianism can be quite exclusionary because it implies that you need to be walking with your feet. But accessibility for people with disabilities is so central to this work. The disability community is impacted by traffic violence disproportionately. So the things we're going to be talking about today, please know that they are important for people walking and rolling, because when we talk about walkability, we're not talking about the physical ability to walk. We're talking about something much bigger than that. And at Walk Boston, we understand that concept in terms of these 6 elements: safety, comfort, accessibility, connections, destinations, and activity. And I'm going to explain a little bit about what I mean by each of these. So safety can mean different things to different people, but there are a few things that we always try to have. So signs and crosswalk markings are really important, as well as having smooth and well-lit surfaces. You can hear someone maybe speeding down my street as I'm talking right now. So having smooth and well-lit surfaces, and also buffers like trees or lampposts that separate walkers from moving traffic. Comfort is also a pretty broad term. It includes maintaining trash and snow removal to keep the pedestrian realm clear and accessible year-round. This is something that, we clear our streets of snow so that people driving can get around safely and easily after there's been a snowstorm, but the same is not always true for sidewalks. And I think this image is a really good example of what that means, where the roads are clear, even though vehicles still may be sliding around. It's not, the road is not necessarily safe, but pedestrians often don't have another option but to walk in the roadway if they need to get somewhere after it's snowed. So keeping our sidewalks clear as well, not just when it's snow, but also of trash and other obstacles, is so important for everyone, but especially as an accessibility issue. And then another part of comfort is having shade and having rest areas and inviting art and architecture that makes people feel like they want to walk. To the point that we were discussing earlier, you can tell the difference between walking on a street that is comfortable and inviting and has beautiful vegetation or interesting building facades versus walking along a plain brick wall with no windows, with no interaction, where you are really just experiencing walking on the side of the roadway. And now the element of accessibility is implicit both in safety and in comfort, but I want to call it out because people using mobility devices are at greater risk of traffic violence. So it's particularly important that we draw attention to the need to keep the walking realm clear and wide, and to have ramps and seating where they are needed, and to have audible cues and tactile things that help people with disabilities navigate the pedestrian realm as well. So we need to be centering the needs of people with physical disabilities as well as with cognitive disabilities. And another core element is connections. Is there a fully connected network of sidewalks and crosswalks so that when you're walking, you're not stranded when the sidewalk ends abruptly or when there isn't a crosswalk where one is needed? Crosswalks need to be frequent enough that people don't have to go too far out of their way to cross the street, especially near important destinations like a bus stop. I think any of us who have taken the bus to get somewhere or have been running late for a bus know the experience of seeing the bus pull up close to the bus stop and having to hedge your bets about whether you can cross in the middle of the roadway or somewhere where there is no crosswalk, or whether you should go all the way around to where the closest but pretty far away crosswalk is, cross over there, and then run all the way back and just have to wait for the next bus. So having crosswalks by bus stops is super important, but also in general, there are so many stories that we hear from folks of having to do a 1 mile round trip to get across the street because of the location of a crosswalk on a busy road. And also, having diverse destinations is crucial. So that includes having retail and offices and restaurants, cafes, food options, as well as housing that appeal to people of different ages, different incomes, and different interests. And related to that is the last element of activity. There are always going to be people who are out walking because they need to be, but the way to encourage more people to choose walking is by having activity on the streets. The kinds of exciting things that draw people out because they feel like they're missing out if they don't come out and catch what's happening, right? So I always say that the reason I love walking is because when you're driving and you go past something interesting, whether it's music or some sort of game activity or an art festival or even just a box of books that someone has put on the sidewalk, when you're driving, you can't really stop or reverse safely to see what's going on. But when you're walking, you have the flexibility to engage and be a part of what's going on in your neighborhood. So having activity, whether it's formal or informal, gets people excited about walking around their neighborhood and participating in what's going on. And so I hope that you could see from the images and examples so far, as well as maybe some of the examples that came to your mind as I was speaking, that walkability isn't only for cities. You can have these features in rural areas, in small towns, in suburbs, and in cities of all scales. They might manifest in different ways, but the essential elements are the same. Okay, so I want to take a quick second to pause here. Debbie, if you have any questions at this point.
Well, I really appreciate the slides. In particular, the one that caught my attention was the one with the activity, how having activities outside will engage people, whether they're taking part in, it looks like there was a chessboard or a checkers, big giant board on the ground, and people are participating. I can imagine how even people who live by themselves, if they were to watch that, they would also have a sense of enjoyment just to see other people having fun. Exactly. And it's just, it's a nice positive contagion to be able to see other people having fun, even though you're not actually a part of that particular activity. So it just reminds me of walking around in Montreal and how different areas had something like that, big giant chess boards on the ground, and people were just taking part of it. It was just really nice. It was really nice. And it made it seem like a very pleasant walk and memorable.
Yeah, exactly. And that is also getting back to the point of how people get to know their community and engage with it, right? Like that is something that is not just a point of joy momentarily, but something that when we are going through a crisis event is so important to have that sense of community and being close-knit enough. Not that you have to know every person in your neighborhood. You don't have to feel like you're living somewhere where you're being watched all the time, but just knowing that passively there are so many people around you who could be of support and who are looking out for you. So even if you're not participating in playing a game, or you're not the one performing at a music festival or something that's happening on your street, or even just performing as a street musician yourself, being in a place where there is that kind of activity makes walking exciting, and it makes you feel like there is a community identity that you are participating in.
Yes, exactly. Thank you.
Yeah. So now we've talked about what walkability looks like and why it's important. So let's talk about how we get there. And Debbie and I have been talking about this a bunch in terms of, you might be wondering why I'm about to focus on infrastructure and on policy. A lot of you might be working in the health field, you might be social workers or concerned citizens. You're not necessarily urban planners. But the thing is that all of us can be advocates, and individual behavior change is not going to solve the systematic and structural barriers to safe and inviting walkable neighborhoods that we have. You can each do all you can to be cautious pedestrians and keep safe, but that is not going to make a neighborhood safer for young children to be able to navigate around. It's not going to make it more accessible for people with disabilities to navigate. For that kind of systematic structural change, we need policy change, we need investment, we need our streets and public spaces to be redesigned to prioritize people. And you can make that happen, and Walk Boston is here to help you make that happen. So I want to walk you through the infrastructure that makes safe, comfortable walking possible, so that you know what you need to advocate for when you see an issue in your neighborhood. And again, if you have a project in mind, Walk Boston is here as a resource to help you figure out who you need to be talking to and working with, and what your strategy should be for getting your project implemented. So let's talk about infrastructure and policies, and let's start with the roadway itself. The most important thing we can do to improve pedestrian safety is to slow speeds. And as this diagram shows, slowing speeds by even 10 miles an hour dramatically increases the likelihood that someone walking who is struck by a driver will survive. And since we're speaking in the context of aging, it's worth noting that these numbers are averages. And we've already established that older people are even less likely to survive a collision like this. And so just keep that in mind as we're thinking about this in the context of aging. So how do we slow speeds? There are a few different policy approaches. For one, Massachusetts has an option for municipalities to opt into a blanket 25 miles per hour speed limit for thickly settled areas. So that helps. Usually the speed limit is higher, and so this helps slow speeds a bit. There are also slow zones like school zones, senior safety zones, and neighborhood slow streets programs that can be implemented at a more local level even. And then a complete streets prioritization plan is a plan to help invest in roadway design changes and on how to slow speeds. And one of those road design changes, and an extremely important one to slow speeds, is narrowing lane widths. So even narrowing a lane width from 11 to 10 feet will slow speeds by 7 miles an hour, and can be done pretty inexpensively with painting a fog line, so those lines that you see on the edge of a road, or putting in a bike lane, or even parking. And I want to, again, pause for a moment here to underscore something that I said earlier, that walking is not just about safety. It's about creating streets and public spaces that make people feel comfortable, invited, and like they belong. So narrowing lane widths can sometimes feel like space is being taken away, but the opposite is true. When we narrow lanes, we're giving back even just a few feet to make incredible changes to the experience of the street, whether it means adding in safer biking infrastructure, outdoor dining, street trees, or any number of other options. That is space that we're giving back to people, and that is something to celebrate and find joy in.
That's a very good point, Aisha. When you narrow the lanes, I find when I'm driving down a street that has both cars parked on both sides, and it's a very narrow passage, I have to really pay attention. I have to pay attention and drive slower so that I don't hit either side of the cars parked on both sides. So very good point.
Exactly. So much of slowing speeds is about getting people to, or designing the street in a way that slowing down is kind of the natural outcome the road design, right? So highways are designed to have minimal distraction so that you can really like focus on going somewhere fast. On our neighborhood streets, we don't want people to treat them like highways. We want to remind them that there are people there, that there might be children running into the street, that other things are going on. And so narrowing the lane width so that people have to focus more and slow down a bit is really good, not just in terms of a collision itself, but also to remind drivers that they need to be more vigilant and pay attention. And again, it's not about just punishing drivers and making it more restrictive. It's about thinking about the way that we want our public realms to look and the kinds of uses that we want them to have. Do we have public space just for cars, or do we also have it for us to be able to enjoy, to have outdoor dining, to have parklets and space where we can enjoy? So with that, let's move to crossings, which is the most common way that pedestrians interact with the roadway. We think about crossings in terms of these three categories: signalized crossings where there's a light, unsignalized where there is no crossing light, and mid-block crossings, which can be signalized or unsignalized. So these are not three distinct categories, but each of these has their own particular considerations that I want to get into. So with signalized crossings, it's really important to have a countdown signal so that pedestrians can assess whether they think they have enough time to cross. Sometimes older people with disabilities don't want to hedge their bets and start crossing if they're not going to have enough time. So letting people know and make that decision for themselves is really good. Also thinking about the phasing, right? So sometimes having pedestrians cross in parallel to moving traffic makes the most sense for a specific street. Other times, it's better to pause all moving traffic so that pedestrians can have a scramble and make, a diagonal crossing if that's what's being commonly done over there. So that really depends on the intersection itself, but it's something to consider, as is the frequency of pedestrian signals and whether or not they're automatic, so that people know that the signal is coming, right? I think very often the times that I've crossed against the walk signal is when I've been waiting somewhere for a really long time and I'm not sure if it's broken or if it's ever going to change to a walk sign. And so then I kind of like decide for myself whether I should cross. Having a walk sign frequently enough that pedestrians can rely on it, and having it be automatic so that it doesn't require them to press the button when they get there and then wait for whatever amount of time for it to go into effect, is also extremely helpful. The other thing that I really love is having a leading pedestrian interval. So that's where the walk sign comes on before the green light comes on for vehicles that are going to turn. Because what happens is if you have a turning lane where drivers are turning across a crosswalk that has a walk sign at the same time, once that flow of traffic starts, it's really difficult for pedestrians to start walking. And by the time the vehicles are done turning, you already get that flashing hand and it's not safe to walk. So if you let the pedestrian stream start first, it allows pedestrians to cross, and then it's much easier for vehicles to catch up afterwards because they're going much faster. And then the last thing I want to mention with signalized crossings is having accessible pedestrian signals that have tactile and audible cues so that people with visual disabilities and people using mobility devices can more easily access the push button. They can turn on audio cues and they can know when the signal is changing and when there is a crossing. So those, you can see in this image, those like bumpy strips that are right at a crosswalk, that helps orient people who are using a cane to let them know where the crossing is and where it's oriented. And then with unsignalized crossings, because there is no designated light for a pedestrian to cross, having a highly visible paint pattern, having it be well lit is extremely crucial. Sometimes also having a raised crosswalk helps with pedestrian visibility because the pedestrians are actually higher and more visible that way. The raised crosswalk also kind of acts as a speed hump to slow traffic as well. And then having Curb ramps and detectable warning strips, again, are really important as an accessibility consideration. And the last thing is having tight turning radii. So when you have a really wide corner, it's easy for drivers to maintain fast speeds as they make that turn. But if you have it closer to being a 90-degree angle, then a driver has to slow down. And in the process of slowing down, it's not just about the speed reduction, but also the fact that it gives them an opportunity to look around more and see potential pedestrians or bicyclists who are coming their way. And then for mid-block crossings, a lot of the same issues, but potentially drivers are paying even less attention to the idea of someone crossing if they're not at an intersection. So again, having clear signage and paint that is really visible is very important. Having it be well lit at night for the same reasons so that people know that there's a crosswalk there. Bump outs and raised crosswalks, again, help get pedestrians to be more visible, because a bump out physically brings them closer into the eye line of a driver, and the raised crosswalk, as I already mentioned, helps elevate them too. And then, having those ramps and detectable warning strips, I can't say that enough, is really, it is part of the ADA requirements for a crossing. Something that I love talking about, because I think it's so simple and yet so important, is this concept of daylighting, which refers to clearing visual obstructions directly before a crossing so that drivers and pedestrians can see each other more easily. And so that really helps with visibility, and it prevents this thing that I think most of us are probably familiar with, of having to kind of bop your head out into traffic to see if there's oncoming traffic before you cross, because you have to look over all of the parked cars or whatever other obstruction there is. So setting parking back by 20 feet at a crossing helps drivers see pedestrians at the crosswalk. It helps pedestrians see oncoming traffic so that they don't have to do that thing. Daylighting is incredible and yet so simple. And one last point on crosswalks is that in addition to having accessible signals and smooth surfaces, snow pileups and puddling are major climatic issues to be mindful of. So it's worth considering whether a raised crosswalk can be added to prevent those obstructions, because that helps deal with the level difference. So puddling doesn't happen at a crosswalk. I know many of us have had the experience of, after a heavy rain or after snow that's melted, all of that water is piled up right as you're trying to get from the sidewalk across the crosswalk. And for people using mobility devices, that's especially hard. But for all of us, it's really difficult to have to, figure out how much you were able to leap to get across the puddle. So a consideration to be really mindful of. Debbie, is there anything that you want clarity on before I keep going with sidewalks? We're halfway through all this nitty-gritty infrastructure.
I love it. I mean, daylighting, that to me is just, it just seems like such a simple way to kind of, it brings awareness to how we can minimize fatalities or pedestrian crashes by just eliminating obstructions, like having, I drive by so many cars who are parked very close to the turning point, or big trucks parked right there. So as a driver, or even sometimes as a pedestrian, I have to kind of inch out into the road a little bit more than I'm supposed to see if there's oncoming traffic. So to be able to fix that type of situation, it's just very important.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the part of the reason that I love daylighting too is that I think it speaks to how very often the best ideas that we can have to improve safety, to improve comfort for people walking, can be extremely simple.
Yeah.
There's no heavy cost of infrastructure that's going into making that change, and yet it makes such a huge difference.
Yep, it does. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about sidewalks, which are kind of the meat and potatoes of the pedestrian realm. The many of the features we want here are things that we've already discussed, having smooth, level, and wide surfaces with no obstructions or interruptions to the walking network. Also, where possible, having a verge with trees helps pedestrians feel like they are buffered from moving traffic, and also, having trees, having greenery adds an added element of comfort. Permanent and impermanent obstructions to the sidewalk are something that we see all the time and something that would never be acceptable in the middle of a driving lane. And yet it is so commonplace on the sidewalk. So whether that's vegetation that hasn't been pruned back, I did a walk audit a little while ago where there was a bunch of poison ivy that was growing into the street. And so that was, that kind of forced people to walk in the roadway. So especially for people using mobility devices or pushing a stroller, that's exactly the kind of thing, like any of these obstructions that are pictured here, are the kind of thing that would force someone off the sidewalk and into the dangerous roadway. So if you see an obstruction like this that's more permanent, of a lamppost or electric box being posted in the middle of the sidewalk, that's something that you should report to the city and flag as an accessibility issue. But also if it's just an issue of vegetation being trimmed back, that's still something that should be done. The other thing is minimizing the number of driveways and other interruptions to the pedestrian path. So as to minimize the number of places where pedestrians have to interact with moving vehicles and risk being hit. So you can see in this diagram, reducing the number of driveways out of this parking lot helps pedestrians move through it more quickly because they don't have to stop so much for cars that are turning, but also reduces the number of places where a collision could happen because there's fewer places where pedestrians and moving cars are interacting. And likewise, narrowing driveways and tightening curb radii is also helpful for not just slowing speeds on a turn, but also increasing visibility. It helps drivers slow down, see who's crossing, and pay more attention. I'd also say that in the second image, having the sidewalk material be continuous so that we are reminded that the sidewalk is not stopping just because there is a driveway is an important reminder that pedestrians should take precedence and should their safety should be prioritized, and that it's not an end of the sidewalk when you're crossing a driveway. So then the last thing that I want to discuss with with this infrastructure is streetscape elements, things like trees, signs, benches, bus stops, trash receptacles, lighting. These are all things that we may not think about as much as the roadway or the sidewalk or a crosswalk, but are all extremely important for creating the kinds of spaces that we've been talking about. Some things that we can do to help older adults and people with disabilities includes providing seating and shade and well-lit street signs and wayfinding signage that has large type, so they're easier to see and to navigate. Also identifying and marking publicly accessible toilets and ensuring that there's ample night lighting especially. Bus stops in particular are a great place to provide covered shelter and wayfinding signage to help orient people where they're going or give them a place to rest. And things like trees, signs, lighting, and seating also help slow traffic and make the pedestrian realm more comfortable, right? They help slow speeds because, as Debbie was saying earlier, you feel more restricted, you're slower, you're paying more attention, but also like for people walking, those are all really nice elements to have. And streetscape elements help foster a sense of activity and of local pride, maybe highlighting the history of a place. And finally, as I've tried to emphasize throughout this presentation, these elements help make people feel like they belong and have ownership over the streetscape and the neighborhood, because walkability at its heart is about connecting people with their community. And I hope that if you've stuck around for this much of today's session, you'll keep this takeaway in mind and think about the ways that you can make your own community more walkable and inviting. And if there's any way that Walk Boston can help you reach that goal, please do reach out to us. We want to be a resource to you, and we want to help people in their own communities lead the change that happens there. So if you have questions, if you have ideas you want to share, please reach out to us. The best way to reach us is info@walkboston.org. So I'm going to stop sharing now so we can see each other better.
Wow, that was amazing. It's just, again, it wasn't until Walk Boston reached out to injury prevention professionals in the Boston area, including myself, to let us know about what Walk Boston is and the type of what's possible for pedestrian safety and being able to create safe spaces, areas for people to drive in and also to walk in, or to be able to use their mobility devices in. So what else do you think people who love to walk or just to be out there, what else can be done to help them be able to enjoy being outdoor and not so much being inside the house, watching TV, sitting around, or just being on internet? What else can pull people out of their house?
Yeah, I think that element of activity is so important, and it doesn't have to be something that's top down, right? Like, it's really nice when city governments are sponsoring events, that they're having things in a farmer's market, or they're having some sort of big community event that draws people in. Those one-off things are really great, or even if they're weekly or something to look forward to, they're great. But people can create those spaces on their own. So one thing that I've really loved seeing over the course of the pandemic, when people are trying to socialize outdoors more, is that people are hosting birthday parties in a park. And even if you don't know the people who are having that birthday celebration, it's just so nice to see other people having fun and to be in proximity to that. And so I would really encourage people to think about ways that they could draw their neighbors out, whether that's something that everyone is invited to. So you post flyers saying that you're hosting a big event, or just even like having a lemonade stand or something. Those are the kinds of things that are really small and may seem kind of insignificant in some ways, but are the kinds of things that foster community, that make people feel like this is my neighborhood and I know my neighbors and we spend time together. That is one small thing I think people can do, but my own personal bias is the best way to make change is to become an advocate. So if you are already someone who loves to walk, and that's something that you want to see improved in your community, hopefully some of the things that we talked about in this presentation today will help spark your curiosity and also the things that you pay attention to more. So if you see an obstruction that would make it hard for someone else to be walking, even if you can navigate around it, make sure that that's reported to the city so that they know that that's an obstruction that people are paying attention to. If you see that walking down a particular street that a lot of people should be walking down because it's got a lot of amenities close by, because it's located in an important place, if that street is really difficult to walk on, especially in the summer because it's so hot, talk to your city about what they can do to increase the canopy there, whether that's planting street trees or even having kind of like a fabric canopy or of some kind. Our summers are getting hotter, and it's something that Massachusetts is not as familiar with as some other places around the world, but it's something that we need to be paying attention to. So if you're seeing issues like that really speak to the barriers that you're facing or that that other people are facing, speak up about it. And if you don't know how exactly to do that and who you should be contacting, contact Walk Boston and we will help make that bridge for you.
You read my mind. I was going to ask you, so if people saw something, they should say something. Who would they say it to? You can't just call, the city and say, okay, this intersection needs better canopy, or because it's getting hot, a lot of people walking around, they look very hot and thirsty. We need more trees. So who would they approach? So you're saying approach or, email Walk Boston. So that way that individual can be directed to the appropriate resource.
Exactly. This is, we have a pretty good sense of who to contact. I hesitate to say, you should reach out to the Department of Public Works for something or the City Planning Department for something, because it's not the same in every community. And we have worked with a lot of communities across the state, so we might have a better sense of that, or we could at least reach out to someone who, might pay attention to an email from us and can help direct us to the right person to contact. The other resource that exists in most communities, and currently we're actually working on compiling a resource that helps people figure out who they should be contacting. But most communities have a 311 number, or another program called See Click Fix, where if you see an issue, like an infrastructural issue, you can take a picture of it or send a comment about it and send the location to the city so that they know that that should be on the list of things that they are addressing. So a lot of communities have that. Your community very well might have it. But if you can't find it, or if you don't feel like that's really getting the job done, Walk Boston is definitely here as a resource.
So the 311 is almost like a 911 call, right? So there's
for non-emergencies.
Great. Can you talk about going back to one of your first few slides, the pedestrian crashes? Do they happen more during the summer? Is there like a seasonal aspect to when these crashes happen? Is it more during the winter time because people are not shoveling the sidewalks and pedestrians are forced to walk on the major roadways?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So typically when I pull this data from, and again, this is publicly available data that MassDOT provides on all of the crashes that happen, not just that affect pedestrians, but all vehicular crashes and roadway crashes. When I look through that data, I typically pull up the data as well on what the weather conditions were. And sometimes there are more crashes when it's rainy and visibility is lower, or after a storm, like a snowstorm, when people have to, really be paying more attention and cars are sliding around more, people are walking in the roadway. But I wouldn't say that those kinds of weather conditions explain the trends fully. I think a lot of it is about, where are people walking? Where do they need to be walking? Sometimes you see a concentration of, like in the city of Boston, for example, you will see a concentration of crashes in the downtown area. And when you look at the downtown area compared to other parts further outside of the city, where the road design is much better for pedestrians downtown compared to places further out of the city, you'd wonder why there are more crashes downtown, but it's just because that's where people are walking more. So there is more of that interaction. And yeah, so I would say that it's, the weather does play some role, but it does not fully explain the trends that we see. A lot of it is making sure that we are designing our roads so that speeds are slow regardless of the weather, and that people are paying attention and are being cautious as they drive, that there are people biking and walking and standing around, hanging out in the street, and that they deserve to be able to do that. So designing our roads in a way that is more conducive to people being able to use that space how they want to.
Mm-hmm. We're almost at the top of the hour. What are some 3 takeaways that you want the viewers to come away with based on what you shared with us today? Can you give us 3 takeaways, and then maybe, if there's time, sharing with us like any other upcoming projects that Walk Boston is going to be doing to help enhance walkability and pedestrian safety?
Yeah, that's a good one. I'm trying to narrow down to 3. I would say on an individual level, I became a much better driver when I started biking in the city as well. I always walked a lot, but I didn't bike very much. And it made me, as I was saying earlier, I think that when you're driving, you tend to pay more attention to the other cars because that's a real threat to you. But when you have the experience of walking a lot, when you have the experience of biking a lot, you pay more attention and you have more empathy for people who are doing that as well. So on an individual level, I would say that if you're someone who typically drives most places, try walking, maybe try biking. It's a little bit more of a stretch, but definitely walking around your neighborhood helps you understand the roadway more. And hopefully from this presentation too, you'll be paying more attention to some of the elements that make it harder to walk and that drivers should be doing. My second big takeaway, I would say, is become an advocate, even if it's not something that you are doing full time. If you see an issue, please try to do something about it. Even if you don't have capacity to solve the problem on your own and to be a crusader for changing that and to be hounding the city planning department every day. Find a way that you can report the issue, that you can share this knowledge that you learned today with other people. The more people we have who are paying attention to this, the more likely we are to have change made, because it is only when people are paying attention to something that it gets changed, right? So please do pay attention. Please talk about it. I know I can be really annoying sometimes because I'm always talking about pedestrian safety and ways that we can make our streetscapes more comfortable and inviting. But you don't have to be as annoying as I am about it, but please do speak up and please share information and make sure that you are helping people in being able to navigate the streetscape better. The last thing that I'll say is there are more and more climatic issues that we are seeing at Walk Boston and just generally that are affecting people's ability to walk, whether that is, and it's not just climate, it's like the number of crises that we are going through as a society. So, as we were saying earlier, part of the explanation for why there are more pandemic crashes might just be the anxiety and the stress that people were feeling and not paying as much attention as they were driving. But then there's also the heat, which is really profound. There's increasing storms that are making it harder to walk when there's that much puddling, when there's that much snow. So becoming an advocate, not just in terms of the very nitty gritty of the infrastructure that you're seeing around walkability, but also some of the systemic issues that make it harder for older people to walk, for communities of color to have safe and walkable neighborhoods. We really need to make sure that our advocacy is not just creating walkable communities in already high-priced communities or communities that are becoming gentrified, but also in places where people have faced decades of systematic oppression. We know that in communities that were redlined last century, so places where Black and brown people and communities were concentrated, those neighborhoods are now 10 degrees hotter on average than non-redlined communities. So those are the kinds of systematic oppressions that we need to be thinking about, not just the infrastructure that makes a place walkable and inviting, but also who has access to it and what the related issues are that we need to be thinking about in terms of advocating for more affordable housing and better transit access. Because one thing, I know that we're really at the end, but one thing that we always say at Walk Boston is that transit is the middle leg of a walking journey. So if you create better transit options so that people can walk to transit and can access it more readily, that's creating the kind of communities that we need. Walking shouldn't just be an option. It should be something that it's not just a luxury. It's something that people should have the ability to do whenever they need to and want to.
Well said. There's just so many layers to solve the problem and so many different ways to kind of, offer solutions. So I appreciate you sharing your last few comments there. It's just very powerful. So Aisha, I want to thank you and Walk Boston for being my guest. And I hope the viewers out there are more aware and inspired to take action. If they see something, do something, calling 311 to be able to get some sort of a solution towards the problem that you are trying to address. So thank you so much, Aisha and Walk Boston. So thank you, everybody. Have a great day. Again, thank you to Quincy Health Department for sponsoring this program. Bye now.